In the airway and breathing course, we have a unit on airway prep. And this is a key unit. And this unit has 4 parts in it. About prepping yourself, which we'll talk about now, prepping your team, your patient, and then prepping equipment lastly. So prep yourself. And this is done while you're working on other stuff, while you're prepping your patient, while you're prepping your equipment. You're having this conversation with yourself. Most of us don't do this out loud, but we really ought to be doing this to ourselves. There's 2 really important things. First of all, this is not about you getting the tube. This whole thing is airway management. It's not intubation, it's airway management. If you have taken a long time, been ineffective, and deprived your patient of oxygenation and ventilation because you are absolutely headstrong about getting that intubation, you haven't helped your patient. You've helped your ego. So yes, we understand that, did you get the tube? Did you get the tube? And hey, he's good at intubation. That's some sort of a inappropriate, probably, measure of competency as a paramedic. It's not about getting the tube. It's about maintaining oxygenation and ventilation. And so the second thing you're prepping yourself with follows with that first problem, that if you are so focused, so completely focused on getting the intubation, you may not move on when you're having difficulty. You may not move on to a blind intubation technique or a supraglottic airway or simply use a bag valve mask. It would be terrible if the patient was worse off because you showed up to manage their airway than if you had left them with the EMRs or EMTs beforehand. And we know for a fact that if you will articulate to yourself, and maybe even out loud, what your plan A is, what your plan B is, and what your plan C is before you start on plan A, you'll be more likely to move on when you need to. So I kind of already preached that sermon, but again, check your ego. This is an intellectual exercise. It's a physical dexterity, a psychomotor skill exercise. This is not about your ego. You will still be the same person you were after the airway management if you didn't get the tube than if you did. So oxygenation is what matters, and that's primary. Ventilation is right up there with it, but it comes in a close second. Intubation is great, but it's not mandatory. Oxygenation and ventilation are mandatory. And so let's talk about this airway plan thing a little bit. And there's a case that we'll have you watch and do some exercise with that's also in the Moodle, called the Elaine Bromley case. Ms. Bromley was an unfortunate lady who went in for a relatively benign elective, more or less, surgery. I believe it was sinus surgery, something that she should have gone home that night without any complications from, and her airway was horribly mismanaged, mostly due to a bullheaded, narrow focus on have to get the tube. A lot of crew resource management issues came into this, in that there were members of the team who were unable to get the team leader to move on to a plan B or a plan C. And so it's a tragic case, and it is one part of the lesson is told by the patient's husband, who is a commercial airline pilot. And of course, pilots have checklists and plan A, plan B, plan C, and their whole thought process seems to be more effective for airway management than what a lot of folks are using when they do airway management. So basically, plan A, that's what you're going to use most of the time. We would like to intubate our patients, and we like to do that by looking directly at the vocal cords, at the glottic opening, and placing the ET tube in there directly under visualization. If that's not going to work, then you need to move on to plan B. And there are several blind, as in unable to visualize, endotracheal intubation techniques. Nasal, digital, the salt airway is our favorite. But there's things to move on to, and you'll need to learn to assess whether you're going to get that tube or not. If you go back in and try just one more time, try something different, you're going to get it, as opposed to saying, you know what, this is a difficult airway that today I'm not going to get, and I need to move on to plan B. And then sometimes you even have to go to plan C. And I usually kind of jokingly refer to that as just go ahead and punt, and use a King Airway or something like that. But there's nothing wrong with managing a patient's airway with a King or a combi tube or an LMA or simply bag mask ventilation. If you're getting oxygenation, you're getting ventilation, that's the goal. The goal was not necessarily to tube. So I sound a little preachy with this, but it really makes a huge difference. And prepping yourself goes on while you're prepping your equipment, prepping your patient, doing some directives, but you need that few seconds to focus yourself and say, this is not about me, it's about oxygenation and ventilation, and I will move on to plan B and plan C if plan A is not going to work. I won't stubbornly sit here and cause my patient further harm. So prep yourself is the first of the four parts, first of the four lessons in the airway prep unit, and prep yourself is key for you to understand.